Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. One of our favorite things about the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide are all the amazing tracking sheets that are printable and included in there for you to kind of fill out and put in your Dungeon Master's binder.
There are great sheets for tracking treasures and NPCs and settlements, but as we were looking through the DMG, we thought that there was one worksheet that was sorely missing, and so we took it upon ourselves to make the Dungeon Dudes Adventure Worksheet. And today we're going to be going over this with you and looking at how we might build adventures and giving you an adventure sheet that you can use at home as well.
If you're looking for an easy, form-fillable way to prep an entire evenings of adventure on just 1 to 2 pages, this might be the solution for you, and you'll be able to download it down below as well. There's a lot to discuss, so let's get rolling.
If you like forms and templates and world building, but prefer to work on a digital format, you should check out this week's sponsor, World Anvil.
World Anvil is an incredible world building, writing, and game mastering piece of desktop software. And just like building the adventure worksheets in the Dungeon Master's Guide, there are tons of article templates on World Anvil that are awesome for creating a really organized way of building out your world and giving you a framework to build upon when you're designing your own game settings, adventures, NPCs, and much, much more. They have chronicles that you can fill out to create the timeline of your world, interactive maps, and so much more that really does help unlock that creativity of your mind by presenting an organized framework to build off of.
World Anvil is not only an amazing place to create your own worlds, settings, campaigns, and adventures, but it's also a great place where you can share information with your players and make it easy for them to navigate all of the information that you present to them within your game world. And best of all, if you look down in the comments or head to worldanvil.com, you can use our code DungeonDudes for 51% off your yearly subscription, which will allow you to get started with your world building for a really great price.
If you find that working with worksheets and templates, it really helps you stay organized when you're preparing your games, you're going to love working with World Anvil, especially if you're like me and you do most of your prep on a computer screen rather than with pen and paper. It's really the best implementation of a digital DM's binder out there, and I strongly recommend you check it out.
So check out the links below or head to worldanvil.com to get started with your world building today. And now let's talk about our adventure template. While we were looking through the 2024 DMG, there were a lot of amazing worksheets available, and there's also a lot of great information on building out adventures and a lot of example adventures in the book. Starting on page 122, they talk about various types of adventures you might have, different ways that you can bring them to life, but they didn't have a template at the end of that chapter that really allowed you to print something out that you could fill out yourself for your own adventures. Even though all the information was there and present, having a form-fillable template gives you the opportunity to actually build and design your own very easily. And when we were looking at other adventure templates out there, such as the one in the Monster of the Week book that is actually pretty great for creating Monster of the Week adventures, and also some amazing work from Mike Shea over at Sly Flourish, who created some adventure worksheets, we started asking, well, why wasn't there one in the DMG? And could we take the information that's presented here and, in collaboration with some of the other amazing worksheets, create something that would allow you to create full adventures or even campaigns at your table?
And so we looked at the example adventures that are sketched out in the Dungeon Master's Guide. One of the things that really caught our eye with them is that they're very brief. And so they reflect a more natural way that I think a lot of dungeon masters, ourselves in particular, actually prepare adventures that you're going to run at the table, rather than the way, say, a published adventure is written out in excruciating levels of detail. For myself, when I prepare my own game, I usually can work off of just a handful of bullet point notes that I put together in, say, a Google Doc or in Evernote or Notion or OneNote. And so I don't need to write things out in the way that you would see them in a published adventure. I can usually work off a single page. And so that's why the idea of having just a printable single sheet that you could run a whole night's game off of was such a compelling idea and felt like such a glaring omission from the Dungeon Master's Guide.
The amount of times in other RPGs that I've used a template that actually just summarizes everything that I'm going to need for the night is really amazing. And so I love the idea of having one for D&D that just allows you to organize your thoughts and notes.
Yeah, so the format that's presented in the Dungeon Master's Guide for the example encounters basically lays out the scenario for an adventure, what level and characters it's for, a couple ideas for adventure hooks, and then it breaks down into several encounters. It's what we might call an encounter-based format of game prep, which is one particular way that you can do this. One of the things that we've actually talked about on the channel in the past is printing out a map and just writing on the printed map what your game prep is. And that might be more a location-based format for prep. So that's an alternative way of doing things. But what we put together today is an encounter-based prep method. It can still work for a location like a dungeon. And in fact, you might print out this sheet alongside a map, maybe one of the ones from the Dungeon Master's Guide or another map by Dice and Logos. And together, you've got all your game prep right there.
Another point about our worksheet is that encounters are divided into the options for either a social, an exploration, or a combat encounter. So a lot of people, when they hear encounters, they think, how many combats am I doing that day? But we wanted very specifically to design this in the fact that if you're running an adventure that involves going to a town, investigating something, exploring the woods nearby, and then fighting monsters, you can do each section of that as a separate encounter. Just because there aren't monsters to fight doesn't mean that there isn't still a motive and important NPCs and conclusions that you can write onto this sheet to help you through those narrative elements of the social encounters, the explorations, and the combat.
So let's go through the sheet that we created, and we'll go box by box and talk about how to break down, what to fill out in each, and hopefully this gives you a great way to prep your next game. First of all, of course, you can give your adventure a title.
Now,
sometimes it can help for creativity.
You're probably not publishing this adventure, so your title could be Fighting a Hag in a Swamp, but your title could be something more evocative, and you could tell your players, today we're going to be running the Hag of Swampy whatever.
Or you can just put in the date.
Or just the date and the level of the players that are going to be playing. It doesn't matter. Just name it something. Give yourself an idea for the overall feeling of this adventure.
The next box that you're going to want to check out is the situation. This is the big picture idea of the scenario and the conflict that is at play in the evening's adventure. What's the problem that the player characters have to solve? Who's the antagonist that might be opposing them? What do they want to do? What they want to happen? This might be something as simple as, kobolds stole my baby, or a dragon is threatening a local village.
You don't need to go too in-depth here as long as it gives you the general idea of what the overall situation is. What is the problem that the players are facing this evening? That leads us into the next box, which is hooks. This is why the players are getting involved. Now, it's important to differentiate these. The situation is what's going on, but the hook is why the players are going to get themselves involved in this. What is the reason? The hook in general is what's going to hook the players and pull them into the adventure.
It could be as simple as they're in the village that's being attacked by the dragon, and if they don't do anything, they're going to get melted. Or it could be that they're being offered a boatload of gold. Or you might make a more personal connection. I like to use this opportunity to look at the player characters' bonds, ideals, backstories, NPC connections, and find a place where I can make it personal for them.
Turns out that one of the players' family lives in the town that's being threatened by the dragon, and now it's very important, and they get the rest of the group to agree to help them save their family. Now you have important and valuable stakes, and a hook that draws the players into really wanting to save this town from that dragon.
If you've got more than one idea, write them all down. In the next section, we've also left out an area for you to write down the key NPCs that might be present in the adventure. These NPCs can be allies or enemies of the player characters. They might be a guide who is traveling with the player characters throughout all the encounters, or they might be a major antagonist like the dragon who could potentially be involved in more than one encounter across the adventure.
Each encounter is going to have a section to put NPCs specific to that encounter into it, but it is important sometimes to just know who the major players in your overarching adventure is, or in the worst case, your key NPCs might just be a list of names of who's in the town, and that can be very helpful as well.
And finally, in the first column, there's just a space for you to leave any additional notes, anything miscellaneous that you might want to write in there that informs the entirety of the entire adventure. Perhaps, for example, there's some sort of environmental effect or wild magic effect that is applied across the entire adventure. Maybe there is some sort of time limit, and you might want to put a clock here to track time across the adventure. Maybe there is some sort of travel constraint or something else happening. That's a good place to note these things down, this kind of meta level construct that applies across all the encounters.
After that, simply the form goes into the encounters. Again, your encounters can be very different depending on what is happening in them, but we leave enough space here to really dig into each encounter.
And now the first page of the form has space for 2 encounters, but we have a second page of the form that has 3. So if you want to have a giant adventure that has multiple encounters in it, maybe more than 5, you could just print multiples out of the second page so that you can prep several encounters at once. This is great if you're doing maybe a big dungeon or something like that. Again, it depends on if you're doing 4 to 8 encounters, how your adventure is. We wanted it to be very flexible so that you can decide how much you want to use.
As with the overall adventure, each of your encounters is going to have a name. Again, you can be as creative as you want here. It could just be fight with kobolds, or you could name that section of the adventure.
Or if you are building a more site-based adventure, like for example, you're doing an adventure in a ruined temple, the encounter titles could actually correspond to the individual rooms that the encounters are happening in. It's up to you how you want to use this as an organizational tool. It might also be that you're doing an encounter or an adventure that is waves of enemies or a chase or a travel scene. So how you title each encounter is a good way of giving yourself some of that organizational structure, because even within this format, the encounters don't have to happen in order.
No, that is one thing to note, is that if you have an open-ended campaign, for example, the dragon situation, there's kobolds in one area, there's NPCs, there's hunters in the woods that you might talk to, there are townsfolk that you might talk to, but it's up to the players where they go and who they engage with first. You can just write them all out and then flip to the encounter that's needed as the players move through them.
Yeah.
Next is the section where you choose whether this is going to be primarily a combat exploration or social encounter. Obviously, some encounters can be sort of a combination of multiple, but generally there is one prevailing idea happening in each encounter, and sometimes it's definitely going to be a fight, and sometimes it might be a social encounter that could turn into a fight, or an exploration that if they go into the wrong area, could turn into a social encounter or a fight.
And for this reason, we've also put in the field for you to pop in the difficulty of the encounter, especially useful if it is combat, so it can either be low, moderate, or high. This is also where you can use the table on page 115 of the Dungeon Master's Guide to work out the XP budget for the combat encounter, so that you can have a reference point for, say, how many monsters you're going to put into the actual combat encounter. Again, assuming it is a combat encounter or likely to be one.
So next up, we have the character objectives. Very simply, this is going to be what the goal of the characters in this encounter is. If it's a social encounter, is their goal to persuade the mayor to lend aid to them or convince the local hunting party to help them navigate the dangerous woods? Or is the goal to kill all the kobolds?
Now, if you need some ideas for focusing what the objective of your players is, page 112 of the Dungeon Master's Guide actually includes a list of possible objectives that you could use, such as finding an object, protecting a location, taking out a specific target. But you don't have to be restricted to the ones that are in the Dungeon Master's Guide. And in fact, you could consider more variations. Maybe the players have to solve a puzzle, or they have to investigate a crime scene, or again, as Kelly said, they have to convince someone of something, or escape a location because they're being chased. There's a lot of different, there's more objectives in here, but this overall character objective is going to help you define what is kind of the main thing that is happening in this encounter and the way the characters are going to engage with it. It's possible, depending on how you stretch the definition here of like the character's goal, that you might make this a little bit more open-ended into the general premise and situation of that specific encounter. But I find that working with like, what is the character's goal in this scene? Like, are they going to disable a ritual or stop a trap? Is kind of the best way to engage with it, because that's thinking of like, how are the players potentially going to engage with what's happening here?
Next up, we have the location features, and this is extremely important because where is this all taking place? If it is in the little town, you can detail what the town looks and feels like and some of the key locations. If they're going into the creepy woods or into the dragon's lair, what is the environment that they are experiencing? Just some simple details so that you can narrate it, so that you can describe it, and so you know what sort of features might come into play while they navigate that environment.
Now, when you are detailing your locations, this is an area where you have the ability, depending on how you're preparing your adventure, to zoom in or zoom out, depending on the level of detail. A great example of this is a scenario that Kelly and I were actually talking about, where the players arrive in town and they need to talk to several NPCs to figure out a mystery that's happening in town. And that's going to then lead them to the next location. Depending on your approach and the way that you want to run that adventure, you might actually decide that you're just going to say, hey, talking to the villagers is an entire encounter. So I'm just going to list out the town square, the tavern, the local temple, the local shopkeeper, and that's all one encounter. But you might want a more detailed approach to that might take an entire game session, in which case you might decide, hey, I'm going to make what happens in the tavern an entire encounter. I'm going to make what happens in the temple an entire encounter and do the whole treatment for that thing. This is up to you to decide the level of detail that you need for your game prep and how much time you want to devote to an individual scene. And it's a great example of like the way you can scale this sheet, because you might make each of these, again, like a single room in a dungeon, or you could have one of these encounters cover multiple rooms. Like, it's really up to you, and there's no right way to do it. It just depends on the level of detail that you need in your own prep.
There are DMs out there who will use a single encounter section for the whole town, and there are DMs out there who want every NPC, every shopkeeper, every person who works at the inn very well detailed. And perhaps there is a chance that the party is going to get into a fight in the inn. Maybe they are going to get into some arguments with some of the people in town. Maybe the whole mystery of finding the answer to the investigation involves sort of unweaving the narrative elements of all of the townsfolk and what they know, in which case it might be important to very much detail that out over multiple sheets. And if that's your whole evening, then you're still using this for your evening of prep.
As a rule of thumb, though, if you think that you're going to spend more than 45 minutes on something, it's probably multiple encounters.
Yeah.
Right. If, again, maybe an hour at the top end, but that's where I would start breaking things out. If you're like, you know what, talking to the various townsfolk, that's going to take the players 45 minutes to an hour, make it one encounter. If you want to have what happens in the tavern take an entire hour alone, that's where basically the decision of how many locations you're actually working with and how many encounters you're actually working with, connect it to time, and think of each of these columns as about 45 minutes to an hour, maybe half an hour at the low end of your game session.
Next up, we have the monsters and NPCs. This one's pretty self-explanatory. If it's a combat encounter with the kobolds, you're going to write how many kobolds are involved. Maybe they have some other monsters with them, and you can include those as well. If it is the inn that they're going to, you put the names of the people who work in the inn and what their sort of roles are. Maybe it's just one NPC that they're going to be talking to, or you could put all of the major NPCs in the town in this box. The mayor, the blacksmith, the innkeeper, and the local fisherman. And those are the NPCs that you detail, and as long as you know who they are, you might have the motivations up here. But again, if you want to detail this even further, you might just have one or two NPCs and write out their motivations and ideals and things like that in this box.
On the other hand, if you're doing a very combat-focused encounter, you might want to write out the challenge rating and XP values for each monster in the encounter with a line or two about their combat tactics or what causes them to surrender or what they do. So for example, if you're building an encounter with several hobgoblins, you might write down Hobgoblin Sergeant, 700 XP, Hobgoblin Devastator, 1100 XP, 10 hobgoblins, 100 XP each. The hobgoblins fight in a phalanx formation, while the hobgoblin devastator throws fireballs and the commander barks out orders, and the hobgoblins run away if their commander is killed.
Next up, we have complications. Now, some combat encounters and some exploration or social encounters might be relatively straightforward and not include a lot of complications. But if you are going to have something that stirs the pot partway through this encounter, this is where you are going to want to write it in. Perhaps while they're talking to the innkeepers in the inn, a group of ruffians show up who actually are part of a cult that worships the dragon, and they don't like hearing that you're hunting this dragon in town. Perhaps if there's a local mystery that you're trying to solve, there is somebody involved in this encounter who is trying to thwart you from solving it. What are the complications that are going to be occurring within this encounter, and how will they come into play?
Other examples of complications that you might want to pull from the Dungeon Master's Guide are the hazards on page 76 or the other environmental features on page 68. So perhaps the encounter with the hobgoblins occurs in a burning building, and you need to use the rules for fire, smoke, and suffocation. Perhaps you are doing an underwater combat encounter, and you'll want to have notes about the rules of that. Again, maybe it's a arcane ritual and there's some magical backlash, so you use a reference from the improvising damage table and write down, avoiding the magical backlash is a DC 10 check, and on a failure, you take 8d6 force damage. This is just an area where you can write things like that in, really quick notations on what might actually occur, and give you some quick DCs of what those hazards, obstacles, other things might be.
Under that, we have key skills, which also you might just detail which skills you think are going to be most useful, just to give yourself a reminder. Obviously, one thing that I like to say as a DM is I'm usually open to the players using any skill as long as they explain it in a relevant way that seems like it would help the situation. But let's say that there is a ritual that they need to disrupt. You might put Arcana as a key skill and say that disrupting the ritual is a DC 18 Arcana check. At the same time, maybe they're trying to get information from the shopkeep in a social encounter, and you might say persuasion, deception, and intimidation are the key skills, and the shopkeep has a DC of 14 or 13 in order to convince them that they should give you information.
Even in a combat encounter, skills can be relevant, and you might want to notate, hey, these are some of the ways that the party can intimidate their foes. These are maybe some of the ways that they can glean information by studying their foes using Arcana or History or Insight. Or again, you might link it into the environmental features. If you really want to expand the definition of key skills, you might even want to look at the class features and spells that your party has access to, and maybe even write down what are some of the possibilities of how your party might engage with the environment. Like, for example, if they are trying to disable a magical circle or ritual, what happens if they cast Detect Magic? Or what happens if they cast Dispel Magic, moreover? This is also a place where if you are using a skill challenge where the party has to have a certain number of successes, like for example, it's not enough to just do one successful Arcana check to stop this ritual. The party maybe needs 3 or 5. That's where you'd note that down, and maybe you would say, actually casting Dispel Magic counts as 2 automatic successes, for example. That's a good place to notate all those sorts of things, those kind of mechanical ways that the players might engage with the encounter.
The next box is for outcomes. Now, this one is very valuable to me, and I think a lot of DMs actually forget to write what the outcomes of their encounters are. The outcome is where you are going to detail what is achieved by finishing this encounter and what pushes the narrative into the further story. The outcome might be that by killing the kobolds, they find a map that leads to the dragon's lair. Or by convincing the shopkeep to work with them, they get important information that guides them down the path to solving the mystery. This is where you might detail the clues that they might find, the path to the next destination, or just some information that they might gather by solving the problems here.
This is also where you can detail some of the possible consequences that might arise from the player's actions. For example, perhaps if the player characters aren't able to deal with the hobgoblins within 3 combat rounds, reinforcements show up. Or a general alarm is raised if things aren't dealt with in a stealthy fashion. Or again, if the players fail to stop the ritual, now the demon is summoned and they have to deal with another encounter on top of things. So consider in the outcomes, what happens if the players fail? Or perhaps there's a side objective or an optional outcome where based on the player's choices, things might not go exactly perfectly. Again, be open-minded to the different ways that your players can engage. This is just a way of you having a few things prepared for what they might do, but stay open-minded to different ways that it could actually play out that you weren't expecting.
Lastly, we have treasure and rewards. What is it that the party gains by accomplishing this encounter?
Where's the loot? Where's the loot?
And if it isn't a situation that has loot, again, you might put outcomes and treasure and rewards and kind of divvy up what we said earlier, where the reward is the map. The reward is the clue. Maybe there's not a lot of treasure to be found, but after they kill the kobolds, the map to the dragon's lair is very valuable. And that actually gives you more space and outcomes to detail what happens if they succeed or fail. And so you can use the treasure and rewards to either say, yeah, they find a +3 longsword, or that's a pretty powerful longsword, or they find the map to the treasure.
Yeah, and at the very least, even if you are doing a social interaction encounter or an exploration encounter, this is where you could write down how much XP the player characters can earn from solving that. Assuming you are using experience points, you don't have to use experience points. You could be using milestones. So there can be more rewards than just treasure, magic items. As Kelly said, there can be narrative rewards. Maybe the players get something they can use for their bastion in some way, shape, or form. But that gives you a place to just note what those possible things are. Maybe not every encounter has a concrete reward in that way, but it's all there if it can be found.
And that basically brings us to the end of the sheet. We have the 2-page worksheet. And for us, this is everything that we use really in preparation for our adventures. I don't generally write more than that when I'm planning my adventures for the day.
I keep things pretty bullet point. And again, you might scale this depending on how much you like to do for your prep. As I said, for myself, I usually write just a couple verbs, adjectives, like write a couple notes down. If I'm writing location features down, I usually will write a couple descriptive words that evoke the different senses. The objectives, I might only write a single sentence, but depending on what your prep style is, you might want to write a little bit more. And you might even find that you can't fit it all into the boxes on this sheet. If that's the circumstance, what we've also got for you to check out is a Google Doc template that you can just take into Google Docs or your favorite note-taking app, and it still has all these headers prepared for you, and you can write as much as you want.
Yeah.
In that case, but I do find that these headings are generally useful no matter how much you want to prepare, because they kind of hit all those key things that you want to at least be thinking about. And even if you are a very lightweight prep person, like you might be the type of person that you only need to write like 3 or 4 words in each of these boxes, and you have everything you need to run an adventure. Different styles are all equally valid, but I find that as long as you've got something everywhere, you'll be really well prepared no matter what your style of prep is.
Monty and I also hope to have a couple sample adventures that we just made up and filled out the form for that you can also download if you would like some examples of the sorts of ways that we use this template to create our own adventure.
A big thank you to World Anvil for sponsoring this episode. Make sure that you check out their site and use code Dungeon Dudes for 50% off your yearly subscription as well.
Other than that, we hope that this gives you everything that you need to plan better adventures and all the things that, and you can use this template as well as some of the amazing templates available in the DMG. I really like the ones that help out with settlements. I think that even if you are doing an adventure that takes place in a town, the settlements worksheet is a great way to tack on more information about what the town or village actually looks and feels like and the sorts of things that they can encounter there, along with the adventure worksheet. And if you need one for game expectations or magic items or further NPCs or traveling, there's a lot of ways that you can build out a multiple sheet system to really bring to life an entire campaign or a whole adventure arc in many different ways.
Yeah, and ultimately, this is just one way that you can prepare for your games and one style of preparation. It's what we would call an encounter-based style of preparation, where you're thinking about your game session in terms of the different encounters or scenes that the players might encounter along the way. Again, these don't have to be in any sort of fixed order, and you might want to use a map in conjunction with this worksheet, especially if you're doing a more site-based adventure, and then you can attach it to the locations in that way. It's meant to be very, very flexible and give you a framework to work with, not a strict formula that you have to keep to for every game you prepare.
We hope that you find this helpful. Follow the links below to get all of the worksheets and all of the options that we've presented here today. And we hope that that helps you plan your future adventures. If you like this worksheet and you want to see us make more options like this, let us know what other sorts of sheets and forms you might want to see from the Dungeon Dudes in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible with the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here and want to help support the channel, if you find this worksheet useful, please consider becoming a patron of the show. The links are down below.
And you can see us going on many adventures in the worlds of Drakenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings right here on YouTube. You can check out all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more advice for game masters in our playlist right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.